Hey, everybody. So I thought I would just read a little bit from Grounded Spirituality. I put up a post this week on Facebook, an excerpt from Grounded Spirituality, where I critically review Eckhart Tolle's Power of Now. And I don't do it just to get off on it or something. I just have learned that the critical review of all spiritual teachings is essential for the preservation of the species. There's no reason why spiritual teachings should be exempt from critical review, discussion, dialogue, all the things we do with every other part of society freely. Somehow the gurus, patriarchal spirituality, has somehow persuaded everybody that you're not allowed to deconstruct, as though they're somehow have transcended review. There's some sacred entity that if you dare to review them, if you dare to talk about them, if you dare to get angry at them, I mean, they sort of set it up that way in the God-objectifying guru world, where the Sangha can't be angry, they can't gossip, they have to forgive. It's a perfect setup for abuse and control. So I started to review and define patriarchal spirituality, the New Cage movement years ago. If you've been following my work, you know that. And then I brought it all together on Grounded Spirituality. And one of the things that I have found so interesting, because I really refer to my own journey in terms of making sense of this thing called spirituality. And my most spiritual moments, which I would define as my most expansively reality-based moments, really happened not through stilling myself, not through silencing myself, but through energizing and enlivening myself. So, I went to like this Jack Cornfield and Stan Groth workshop years ago called Insight and Opening. And we would sit with Jack and do sort of Vipassana, which I started to call Vipassana, because I felt like in many ways I was trying to sort of find this place of equanimity or calm while bypassing all of the agitation or unresolved emotional stuff that came from my life and just came from living in the culture. And then I did this like really intense 3-hour holotropic breath work with Stan, discharged all these holdings, all this stuff, just physically, somatically. And at the end of it, I felt radically still, radically peaceful, and radically alive at the same time. And my feeling was I could have sat on that cushion with Jack for 4,000 years and never got to what I got to with Stan in 3 hours in a holotropic. And why was that? And that was because I was energizing my somatic structure. I was breathing deeply into it, which brought all kinds of stuff, excavated all kinds of material that needed to move, right? The monkey heart, rather than obsessing over the monkey mind. The more I discharged what I was holding here, the more my mind calmed down, the more I felt peace with path, and the more attuned I was to like a unity consciousness field. So, when I put up this piece on Facebook, which I've done often, where I critically review Power of Now, and I'm not focusing really only on Tolle. Tolle is sort of like a metaphor for, all kinds of traditional patriarchal teachings. There's nothing new there. He calls something a pain body. I think that was the term that he used. But really, he's just saying the same thing that I've been reading in these books forever. And I don't resonate with them. Not that I think there's anything wrong with accessing some of those meditative techniques in order to still yourself and center yourself at certain times to experience that form of presence and to be able to, have access to some kind of a unity consciousness experience. But if you don't still come back down into the enlivened body and, alchemize and integrate whatever realizations you've had with your humanness, then to me, you just end up sort of bifurcated like him. You sort of talk like an automaton. And the reason that happens, the reason you'll often see people who call themselves enlightened, and he calls himself enlightened in the preface for that book. You'll often find them being so still and silent is because what's happening is they have all kinds of stuff because we're human. And that's where we're at as a collective. We're still holding all kinds of trauma. And then they find this way of pulling away from the world. It used to be in caves, now it's in the house on the cushion with the door closed. And they spend so many hours in this kind of meditative stupor. Eventually, it becomes a bit like a drug trip, and they fixate on silence and stillness. Why do they do that? And then they end up, kind of bereft of feeling, talking like automatons, and calling that awakened, which is ironic, of course. And the reason why they fixate on stillness is because movement brings up their stuff, right? It activates their stuff. The reason they focus on silence is because sound activates their stuff, their triggers, their unresolved material, right? The reason they bash the ego is because they have all kinds of egoic issues like all of us do. The reason they bash and want to turn around your story and eventually deny the existence of veracity or significance of your story, which is not my view. My view is your story is your glory. But they do that because if they can get away from their story, they can find this thing they call peace. And it's good to find moments of peace and perspective and all of that. But when you start calling that awakening and start calling that enlightenment, you have a problem. A lot of times they bash feelings. Feelings aren't real, they're an illusion because it hurts for them to feel their feelings. So that's one version of something called awakening, or the experience of the absolute self, as though there is such thing as an absolute self, independent of the individuated self. It doesn't even really make sense. So in the foreword to Grounded Spirituality, Andrew Harvey, who brilliantly understands these things, he has a paragraph that I want to read you that I think helps to sort of contextualize this nonsense, mostly. And again, I just want to say there's nothing wrong with exploring those ways of functioning, those ways of knowing spirituality, those ways of accessing reality. But the problem is when you stop there, call it enlightenment, and you move through your life basically like an automaton. I'm not sure that's really the place we need to go as individuals, and certainly as a collective. We're not going to do what we need to do to save this species from its own trappings if we're all, experiencing this kind of pseudo equanimity, what I call self-avoidance that masquerades as enlightenment. It's not going to get us too far. So here is Andrew's paragraph. The ancient alchemical path has 3 stages. First, profound experience of transcendence that reveals divine identity. This makes obvious the truth of what's written in the Upanishads. You are that. Okay, so you have that experience of this thing called transcendence that reveals something called divine identity. So let's say it gives you a vaster perspective on the self. Okay. Again, this makes obvious the truth of what's written in the Upanishads. You are that. Here's the key. The patriarchal traditions have mistakenly taken this stage for enlightenment. So they confuse relief with resolution, right? It's very relieving. Tolle described his suicidal history in the preface to Power of Now. Then he has some kind of a experience. Psychologists might call it dissociation. He calls it awakening, where he no longer feels connected to all of the pain that he's holding, the trauma of the human experience. And he talks about his traumatic childhood at some point in one of the books. And then he says he sits on park benches for a couple of years in a state of what he calls bliss. Is it bliss, or is it just the feeling you get when you're no longer connected to, you've disconnected or dissociated from your stuff? Let me continue. The patriarchal traditions have mistakenly taken this stage for enlightenment, but the alchemists knew that this was only the first stage. The second stage is the stage that Jeff is such a master of. Forget that part. That's actually not true. But this part is. This is where the deep knowledge of the transcendent and the forces aroused by that knowledge are consciously integrated step by step with mind, heart, soul, and crucially, and most importantly, the depths of the body. Okay? So the second stage is, so let's say you have this thing called the transcendent experience or perspective arises, through a meditation practice, through whatever practice, through stillness and silence, bashing the ego and all that stuff. Then what? Now you're still human, you're still carrying your story, you're still carrying the trauma of your individual experience and your ancestral experience. It didn't go away or evaporate. So what do? What you do is you have to figure out a way to weave it all together. That's the alchemy. So then he says, as the second stage progresses, the third stage, which is called the simple thing, I love that, starts to emerge. And for this stage, there are very few descriptions because very few people have truly matured in the mystery of profound union with all that this stage brings. ... The choice to ground transcendence in the depths of reality. So that's the idea. And I would say, I've had some really good talks lately with Govey Strauss about this, that I'm not sure that the experience of this thing called transcendence that you have from the desire or intention of getting up and out of here is even this qualitatively the same experience of something we might call transcendence if you're doing it with your feet on the earth, deep inside of your body. And I think that was my experience. I felt like, okay, so when I had that sort of a meditative experience, did a lot of meditative practice for a period of time. When I could kind of crack through kind of the veneer of my humanness and arrive at this kind of sense of realization, the vaster perspective, it was nice. It felt like a little reprieve. But it's very different from the experience of this thing we might call transcendence, or not call transcendence anymore, say, vaster awakening, that emerges at the end, for example, of a very intense bioenergetic or holotropic breathwork stage. Because then you're in your feet, you're in your body, you're in your kishkas, your belly, your heart is more open, you've cleared more debris, so all of those fragmented lines that we live in, these fragmentations and parts, start to come together and weave, something I call enrealment in the book. And then when you begin to have a perspective on something more than, or it's not even more than it, more it's something that's like flowing from the depthful experience of the individuated self. So you're not here and there, you're here. And you don't, my experience is it's not even vertical. The vertical thing, higher than, heightened consciousness, feels like it's part of the bypass. It feels like it's part of what Tolle is doing. My experience is the more I went here and cleared the debris here and reinvigorated and reintegrated the lines energetically, and became more fluid and present and earthbound and body-centered, that thing called vaster consciousness or unity consciousness didn't go up. We're not birds. Where am I going? It doesn't even make any sense. It went more horizontally. It went more into the relational field. It went more into a connection to an appreciation of nature. It went down deeper, deeper, deeper into the grounded. It's not so grounded as to be buried, but grounded as to be solidly rooted on earth. It's a very, very different experience of this thing called unity consciousness when it's coming from an embodied self-experience. And in my experience, every time I've had that experience where it feels more woven and integrated, it didn't come through stillness and silence in particular. Maybe sometimes, but primarily it came through movement, sound, energy, enlivening, sensuality, sexuality, physicality, being inside of this body, excavating all this material held in those trauma tunnels, bringing it to the surface, moving stuff on out so that I could come back down into my body more comfortably. And from that comfort within the body itself, begin to move outward naturally and organically in the earth plane. Very different view of awakening than the view that Tolle and all the patriarchal spiritualists have been espousing forever and ever and ever, And for me, the measure of it is like when I would work with Alexander Lowen, who was like 90 years old, and he was like the co-founder of bioenergetics. That guy was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. He didn't have to talk about awakening. He just felt awake. And whenever I would sit, before people like Tolle and some of the other non-dual people, the Advaita movement, I call it the Avoida movement, I couldn't feel anything coming off of them. It felt like they had just killed everything human and confused that with enlightenment. Yeah. Anyway, those are my thoughts for today. Thanks.